When it comes to video game debates, I think one of the biggest debates of the past 5 years or so has been Breath of the Wild versus Ocarina of Time, which is the better Legend of Zelda game. Ever since Breath of the Wild came out back in March of 2017, this has been a conversation that we've been having kind of over and over again, especially in online spaces where you can debate with random people that you don't even know. But this has actually been brought back into the limelight recently in a very unexpected place. It was taking place during a Stone Cold Steve Austin Broken Skulls interview. Stone Cold Steve Austin had Cody Rhodes on the show, and he asked him what's his favorite Legend of Zelda game, to which Cody said Ocarina of Time. Stone Cold then gave his answer. Well, let me tell you something, fella. I'm a bit of a Breath of the Wild fan. What? Stone Cold. And that's the bottom line, because Stone Cold said so. And that really caught a lot of people off guard. I think mostly because of the fact that I never expected Stone Cold Steve Austin to be a Breath of the Wild fan. But once again, it has sort of spurned on the flames of this conversation and debate. And a debate it is indeed, because it's very, very hard for a lot of people. Now, you may have your own opinions on this subject. Please sound off in the comment section down below, because I like a good debate. Keep it clean in the debating stuff, but definitely sound off in the comments, because I mean, it helps out with the algorithm and stuff. I'm trying to get this video some views so I can make some money. So debate in the comment section. Do not click on any WhatsApp links or talk to WhatsApp people. They're fake. I made a video about it yesterday. Please go watch that. But we're going to talk about these two games, Breath of the Wild and Ocarina of Time, talking in 5 key categories to try and decide which is the better Zelda game. Is it Ocarina of Time or is it Breath of the Wild? Let's get into it. So we're going to start things off with our first category, and that is the first thing you notice about a video game, of course, graphics. Now, Nintendo fans, you could sit there and say, oh, graphics don't matter. There was a time and place where Nintendo prioritized graphics. You might be a little too young to remember that, but up until the GameCube era, Nintendo prioritized graphics. And graphics are obviously a very important thing in video games, because if you don't like the way a game looks, you're probably not going to end up playing the game. It's kind of hard to look past graphics for a lot of gamers. Now, this on the surface level, if we're just taking it in 2022 standards, it's an easy conversation. You would say, oh, well, Breath of the Wild looks better. It's in HD, the art style is better, and so on and so forth. But I don't think that's fair in this debate, because you can't take a game from 1998 and pit it just strictly on technological aspirations against a game that came out in 2017. It's like comparing your first YouTube video to your last one. You know, there's obviously a jump in quality. At least hopefully there is. At least hopefully you're growing a bit. So you can't really do it in that manner. You know, obviously 1080p wasn't around back in 1998. So how do you do this? I think you have to sort of go back into a time machine and look at the game itself in 1998 comparative to the games surrounding it in 1998. And then you kind of start to paint a bit of a different picture, I feel, because comparatively speaking, when you look at Ocarina of Time and when that game came out in 1998, look at the games that were around it. Look at the game's graphics that were around it from that time frame. Of course, you had Super Mario 64 that came out in 1996 that absolutely blew people's minds. From the console side of things, you had things like the PlayStation 1, and of course you had the Sega Saturn. But when it came to 3D graphics, the N64 was king. They could do a lot more because it was the stronger system from a bits standpoint, and that's always a fun conversation. The bit wars, like, you think console wars are stupid nowadays? At least then we had numbers to talk about. Like, well, it's a stronger system, but now everyone talks about teraflops and crap like that. I don't know, it's annoying. But when you look at when Ocarina of Time came out, it was one of the best looking games, if not the best looking game in that sort of style. Yes, there are frame rate issues with the game that are definitely apparent in 2022 standards, but back then you didn't have any sort of open world style games like this that were these large adventures. Super Mario 64 was a great looking game, but it was much more contained. It was much more, you know, rigid in how you went into a level. You had the castle as the overarching area, but there really wasn't all that much stuff to do within the castle. Whereas with The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, once you get out of Kokiri Forest, it's like a whole new world. Like, you're just taken back by all the things that are going on within that world. Now compare it, and we'll talk about worlds in a minute, compare it to Breath of the Wild. Now, from a technical standpoint, Breath of the Wild does look better. A lot of people like the art style of Breath of the Wild a lot more than something like Ocarina of Time, which at that time was going for something a little bit more gritty and a little bit more realistic. But compare 2017 games to Breath of the Wild, and now we have a completely different conversation. Because whereas Ocarina of Time was one of the best looking, if not the best looking games of 1998 on the console side of things, was Breath of the Wild one of the best looking and best running games of 2017? You know, you have to compare apples to apples with this. Apples to oranges would be comparing a 98 to a 2017 game, you know, with a huge amount of time between these games. And I think talking about Breath of the Wild, you can't say that it was one of the best looking games from a technical perspective, because there was things like frame rate issues. We have seen games that are open world that looked and ran better on other platforms. Now, you could make an argument that, you know, for the Wii U or for the Nintendo Switch, it's one of the best looking games, and sure, you can do that, but there are other systems out there. There are other systems out there that do things like prioritize graphics. So is it fair, at least on the console side of things, to deduct points from Ocarina of Time when that was like a standard breaking game, whereas Breath of the Wild wasn't quite that way? It's still a great looking game. There are some performance issues from time to time in Breath of the Wild, much like we saw in Ocarina of Time, but I think they're both great looking games, you know, for their time frame. But the fact of the matter is, when it comes to graphics, Ocarina of Time is better because you have to compare it to what games came out along the same time. You can't say that Breath of the Wild was one of the most technically advanced games in terms of graphics, because it really wasn't. It really wasn't. And I know it's going to rub a lot of people the wrong way, but in terms of graphics, I have to give it to Ocarina of Time, because when you compare it to what else was out there at the time, it was the bee's knees. It was top of the hill. It was definitely right up there, if not the best looking game. And I don't think you could say that the same thing about Breath of the Wild. So I'm already looking at my timer for this video, and we're well over 7 minutes for the first topic. So I'm going to try to keep it a little bit snappier, but who knows? This could end up being a really long video. So strap in, kiddos, grab yourself a drink and a snack, because we got 4 more topics to talk about. Our next topic is going to be gameplay and controls, because to me, you could have the prettiest looking game in the world, but if the gameplay sucks, you know, who cares? And when it comes to Ocarina of Time and Breath of the Wild, I think they're very far apart. They're very, very far apart, but I think it's a good conversation because of what both of these games did. Now, up until Ocarina of Time came out, The Legend of Zelda was, of course, a 2D game. And then Ocarina of Time came out, and it was a 3D game. It really transformed things from the previous entries in the series. Now, you can make a case that it was similar to A Link to the Past in terms of the gameplay, just from a different perspective, but still, that really changes things up. Yes, it was a formulaic Legend of Zelda game, in which Breath of the Wild was a completely different thing. It was a revolutionary thing, because they got rid of the formula that they've been using since the dawn of the Legend of Zelda franchise. Ocarina of Time, of course, you know, it's your basic construction as far as the gameplay is concerned. Yes, you have a large area to visit, but you can only visit these areas on certain times. You have to get these different abilities that you get throughout the game. You have to go into dungeons that, of course, offer different things like progress and story elements, whereas in Breath of the Wild, you could do whatever you want. You know, there is no set path. There is sort of a little guidance if you want to sort of follow the path that Nintendo set for you, but it's completely different. You know, it relies a bit more on things like survival from weather elements and weapons breaking and crafting things. Whereas with Ocarina of Time, you don't have any of that. You don't have any of that. You have pretty much a traditional action-adventure game with RPG elements that we had come to expect from The Legend of Zelda at that time. So is there an advantage between either of these games? I don't know that you could sit there and point to something in terms of the gameplay and the controls. I guess we should mention the controls. They're clunky for both games, okay? You could sit there and love the controls, but they're clunky for both games. I don't know that you can actually sit there and say that one gameplay style is better than another, because it really comes down to preference. Obviously, you have the Sheikah slate in Breath of the Wild, so you could do a lot of things with that as far as physics are concerned. And with Ocarina of Time, you don't have an element like that. It seems like, you know, the game just puts you on this set course where you could sort of veer off the path and have some side stuff going on, but your main gameplay experience, is pretty much a streamlined thing, whereas with Breath of the Wild, it's not. It's a lot more open, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the end. So as far as a concrete gameplay style is concerned, it really just boils down to what you like. You know, what you sort of prefer from your Legend of Zelda games. Do you prefer the more traditional style, or do you like this more open-ended style where you can, you know, do whatever you want? And of course, the survival elements, do you enjoy those? Personally, I did enjoy the survival elements. I know a lot of people didn't, because, oh, why'd my weapon break, blah, blah, blah. But I thought it added another layer of fun to the game. I can't really pick one. I can't really pick one in terms of gameplay, because I do prefer the more traditional experience, but I think Breath of the Wild did something so different and so unique that you can't undermine it, and you can't say, oh, because maybe you preferred the older style, that the newer style isn't good. So I'm gonna give this a wash. You know, I'm not gonna pick one on this, but maybe you will. Our next topic is the worlds, because once again, much like the gameplay style, the worlds of Hyrule in which you are visiting are vastly different, and this sort of does tie into the gameplay, which is why I put it where I put it. But I sort of touched on this with things like the Sheikah slate, the physics engine, but the worlds are definitely very different, because like I said, whereas Ocarina of Time has you more on a set path, Breath of the Wild is a much more open game. It's a much more open game in terms of what you can do. You can't just rush to Ganon in Ocarina of Time. You can't do it. You can't do it. You have to have all your abilities in order to get through the dungeons. You have to go through the dungeons in order to get these other abilities. You have to go on this set path. In Breath of the Wild, if you got the balls and the skill, you can literally go to the end game right at the start of the game. Just make a beeline, jump off, get to the right spot, so on and so forth. So that really, you know, makes things very different in terms of the world construction. Whereas Ocarina of Time feels like an open world, and there are open world elements to it, but it's definitely more streamlined. Whereas Breath of the Wild is truly an open world. You could do things at your own pace. You can go about your own pace. And the world itself, I gotta give it a little bit more to Breath of the Wild because of the Guardians. I really like the fear and tension that the Guardians bring into things. There's a very satisfying experience that you can have in Breath of the Wild. And playing through that game a couple different times, you're not going to experience everything that that game has to offer in terms of the world, in terms of seeing all the different things, coming across these little establishments, these little, you know, camps of enemies and stuff. Whereas with Ocarina of Time, and you know, you could say it's because of technical limitations, that's a much more streamlined game. It's a much more streamlined world. There's not quite as many things to see. There's not quite as many side quests to do. You know, there are a good amount of side quests, but there's just not as much stuff in Ocarina of Time comparative to Breath of the Wild. Now, we could go back and say, well, you can't compare a 1998 game to a 2017 game in terms of in terms of the world building like you did with graphics, because, you know, it's not the same. And, you know, while that is true, it's still, you know, you have to look at the world for what they offer. And in terms of the world, I definitely like Breath of the Wild a bit more, just because there's more stuff going on. There's more stuff to see. There's more stuff to explore. There's more stuff that will surprise you. There's more elements that are added into this game. And yes, that is a technical limitation of Ocarina of Time, but I'm gonna, you know, it's my video. If I want to change my mind halfway through the video on how I'm gonna grade things, I'm gonna do that because it's me. Like, what are you gonna do? You gonna argue in the comments section down below? Feel free. But in terms of the world, I'm gonna give it to Breath of the Wild. I think Ocarina of Time has a great world, especially for the time frame that it came in. But you can't deny all the other stuff that you could do in Breath of the Wild because of things like the physics engine, because of things like the Guardians that are constantly stalking you. It definitely adds a lot to it. Next up, I want to talk about the stories without getting into any spoilers or anything like that. Just looking at maybe how the stories are presented in these games, because once again, Much like everything else in this video, the stories are presented in a drastically different sort of manner, you know, as far as getting the information and accepting the information. Whereas with Ocarina of Time, the information is thrust right in front of you. You know what's happening. You get the cutscene at the start of the game. You understand what's going on. You know right then and there what your path is going to be, and then you take that path. Along the way, you meet a variety of different characters. You get a lot of twists and turns. You have your main antagonist, all this sort of stuff. And it's a very traditional story as far as Legend of Zelda games are concerned, and really just games in general from that era. You have a start, you have a middle, you have a conclusion, you have some sort of, you know, resolution at the end. It's a very open and shut thing, which, you know, a lot of people like. But then you have Breath of the Wild, which once again is a completely different thing in terms of how the story is distributed, because it's completely different. It's so much more open to interpretation. Yes, you get that little intro cutscene. Yes, when you beat the game, you get an ending, but there's so much that's not talked about. There's so much that remains unsaid from that story, you know, meeting different characters and meeting different characters along the way in different villages and towns. It really starts to, you know, become a lot more open-ended. You start to question things more. Of course, there are other games that build upon this story, such as Age of Calamity, which, you know, gives you a different insight into things. And I just feel like the way that they told these stories are just, you know, they're so completely different. And that's kind of a running theme that you might have been noticing with this video, is that while they're similar in name, you know, the execution is very, very different. So it kind of boils down to what sort of story you prefer. Do you prefer a story in which you sit down, you read a book, you watch a movie, you understand everything from start to finish, it's wrapped up in a nice tidy little package, and then you go about your day? Or do you prefer a story where you actually have to think? You have to sit there, you have to draw your own conclusions, you have to draw your own analysis, you have to sort of speculate on the end that keeps things a bit more open-ended to, you know, work on sequels and stuff like that, because you assume that the story will continue in the next game. And like I said, that really just comes down to personal preference. For me, I like both. Like, I like both. I don't think I could sit there and say, well, Ocarina of Time had a better story because it was much more contained, and, you know, you had your start, your middle, your end, whereas Breath of the Wild was just all over the place. You know, it was a lot more open to interpretation because they didn't force the story down your throat like they've done in every other Zelda game up until this point. It really just comes down to personal preference. I think both stories on their own tell a great tale. It's just how you want that information presented to you that's going to make you lean towards one side or the other. And the final area of discussion before wrapping up this video is the legacy. The legacy that these games will leave, because I think they're both leaving extremely different legacies. And you know, you might not quite understand where I'm coming from with that, but I'll get into it. So when you look at both of these games, they do have a lot in common in terms of the legacy, which is, of course, the fact that these were some of the best games of their respective years for 1998 and 2017. The game won many awards as Game of the Year. They both got very high marks from reviewers and stuff like that. Both of them were very impactful games, and both of them were games that people still talk about today because, I mean, we're having this conversation in 2022. But what did they do for the legacy of The Legend of Zelda? Because really, when you think about it, they're both very similar in terms of a turning point, you know, in terms of a revolution for the Zelda franchise. You know, much like Super Mario World to Super Mario 64, that was a huge jump. Everything changed from then on out with Mario games, at least the 3D Mario games. And you could say the same thing for Ocarina of Time. Like, you took the 2D Zelda world and transformed it into a 3D Zelda world, which pretty much became the standard up until 2017. You had every Zelda game that followed that formula that we have talked about, where, you know, you start out, you don't have anything, you go to dungeons, you get more stuff. With that stuff, you could access different areas, access different dungeons, rinse and repeat, go to the other dungeons, get the more abilities, unlock more stuff in the game, and then get to the game's conclusion. Whereas with Breath of the Wild, it was completely different. You know, it once again changed up the formula from what we had seen, but maybe took it in a bit more of an extreme manner. Because now you have the debate about traditional Zelda games versus games like Breath of the Wild. And there's a reason that people have that debate, because of the fact that, well, it's a very different Zelda game. It was unlike anything that we had seen at the time, and the impact was definitely felt throughout, you know, the Nintendo community, the Legend of Zelda community, and it's still debated to this day. So people love Breath of the Wild, people love Ocarina of Time. These are the two pillars of the Legend of Zelda series. So which game leaves the longer legacy? Which game leads the longer, you know, wow moment as far as impacting the Zelda franchise and taking it to new heights? You can't really say. You can't, and I know that's not what you want to hear, but you can't really say, because we still haven't gotten our sequel to Breath of the Wild yet. We, of course, have had a million games in the style of Ocarina of Time. You could sit there and make a case that pretty much every 3D Zelda game since Ocarina of Time was based on Ocarina of Time as far as the gameplay structure was concerned. You can't quite do that yet with Breath of the Wild, because we haven't gotten Breath of the Wild 2 yet. We don't know how similar it's going to be, but what they're going to expand upon, and we don't really know the future of the Zelda franchise, because, you know, hindsight is 2020. I could sit here and analyze things from Ocarina of Time, the N64 era, but I can't quite do that yet with Breath of the Wild, because enough time hasn't gone on. We haven't gotten enough stuff to sort of, you know, go alongside of this game to really come to that conclusion. And I think at the end of the day, that's what you have to do with this in general, with this debate in general. I don't think there is a clear-cut winner. And I know that's not what you wanted to hear, you know, at the start of this video, but I really wanted this video to exist to make you think, to make you see my perspective and then draw your own conclusions. Because yes, in terms of the graphics, I'm going to give it to Ocarina of Time because of the time frame. That's the only thing you can really do with that. In terms of the world itself, I'm going to give it to Breath of the Wild, because that world was so vast. There were so many things to do within that world. It's a better world, clear cut, even if you are taking time into comparison. But everything else really just boils down to the player, what you prefer, what you want to see out of a game. I guess if you ask me which game I would rather play, Ocarina of Time or Breath of the Wild, I would ask you one thing: how long am I playing this game? Is this a game where I only have one video game to play for the rest of my life? Because if that's the case, I would play Breath of the Wild. But if it's a game where it's like, okay, you have a week to play this game, you know, enjoy it, I would probably play Ocarina of Time, because I think I enjoy it a little. I like the structure a little bit more than Breath of the Wild. But in terms of an open game, Breath of the Wild is going to give me a hell of a lot more time, because of the fact that it is so open and there's so many things you could do. So is there a clear-cut answer? Maybe there is, and maybe you are the one who can provide that. You are the one who can give that clear-cut answer, because really, at the end of the day, it comes down to personal preference. I mean, there's a few key areas, like I said, that we could say, okay, well, this game is better than the other game, and no questions asked. But everything else, you know, everything else is open to your interpretation. So the life lesson here is, what's the better game, Ocarina of Time or Breath of the Wild? The only thing that matters is what you like at the end of the day. If you prefer one over the other, who cares about what some other jackass on the internet says? Like, don't let them rain on your parade. Enjoy the game that you like. Enjoy the game that you want to play, because like I said, you could easily make a case for either one of these games being the better game. You know, do you like the traditional style, or do you like the more open style that Breath of the Wild brought about? They're kind of very different, even though they are both Zelda games. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Like I said, you give me a week to play a game, I'm going to pick Ocarina. You give me the rest of my life to play the game, I'm going to pick Breath of the Wild. Take that as you will. And as always, guys, thank you for checking out this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope it didn't ramble for too long. I have no idea how I'm going to fill up all of this time with video footage and stuff like that. I'll figure something out. Make sure you guys hit that subscribe button if you are new to the channel. Like, comment, and share. Be sure to debate in the comment section. Have a nice, clean debate. You know, let's keep it somewhat clean there. You know, don't be going crazy like I do sometimes, yelling at people on WhatsApp. Don't click any WhatsApp links. And as always, I'll catch you guys on the next video. Later.